It's very important, given the nature of the climate crisis right now, for the general public to have an understanding of what progress is or is not actually happening. And I think many readers right now, they'll see these hundreds and hundreds of companies making these big, bold climate claims. And they would be forgiven to think that, we're well on our way to meeting the emission reduction trajectory we need to be on. And the reality of the matter is we're just not on that trajectory. And a key reason for this sort of disconnect is the use of offsets that aren't doing what they claim to be doing.
We have a massive potential for sort of willful blindness. We can convince ourselves of things regardless of what the facts are. And so that's what tends to happen in these cases. It's not that anybody is setting out to commit climate fraud. They sort of walk themselves into a situation and they convince themselves of one thing, and that allows them to convince themselves of another thing. But at the end of the day, they're doing something that makes no sense at all.
My name is Ben Elgin. I wrote the story about how the billion-dollar market for carbon offsets is setting back the fight against climate change. So one of the challenges in reporting on carbon offsets and trying to figure out what's going on is really finding good experts who have been steeped in this marketplace and are willing to candidly talk about it. One of the best people for this is a fellow named Mark Trexler, and I've been talking to him for more than a decade.
My name is Mark Trexler. I've worked in climate change for the last 30 years. I was actually hired by the World Resources Institute in Washington to work on the first carbon offset project in 1988. In terms of defining a carbon offset, one of the beauties, so to speak, of greenhouse gases, sort of the silver lining of greenhouse gases, when you put up a molecule of CO2 into the atmosphere, it can be anywhere in the planet in 7 days. And therefore, if there's an option to reduce emissions on the other side of the planet, and you can do that very cheaply as compared to doing it in your factory, for example, then why not pay that person, that factory on the other side of the planet to reduce their emissions? Then you are, in a sense, offsetting your emissions, and the atmosphere doesn't really see your emissions anymore.
So carbon offsets have been around for quite some time, and they were actually key with these international climate agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol, which mandated the wealthiest countries reduce their greenhouse gas emissions.
The treaty was signed on the 11th of December, 1997.
Decided.
The business community in general saw carbon offsets as a huge opportunity to comply with whatever policies and measures might be coming down the pike on climate change much more cost effectively.
We've seen a huge surge in companies making big proclamations about how they're going carbon neutral or zeroing out all of their carbon emissions.
We're going to reduce our carbon footprint to net zero.
Unilever is committing to net zero emissions.
We can achieve a net zero emissions world.
We began looking at these corporate claims of dramatically reduced emissions, and we noticed so many of these companies were using carbon offsets to achieve these aims. And as we began to look at the carbon offset projects themselves, what we found is that the environmental benefits claimed by these companies are not actually what they seem to be. And as we sort of saw and spotted a number of these very aggressive carbon offset projects, which appeared to be generating inflated credits or bogus credits, we saw a number of them were associated with the Nature Conservancy. And this surprised us. The Nature Conservancy is the world's biggest environmental group. They have about $1 billion a year in revenues. And they've been around for 7 decades. They've preserved about 125 million acres of land. And they've done so many good works over the years, and they've been very strong in terms of working with corporate partners. The Nature Conservancy has taken a different approach, a very pragmatic and pro-business approach. They will not go out and criticize a big polluter, but they're very happy to work with them. Some might say that, well, that's selling out, but others would say, and those at the Nature Conservancy would say, these companies have deep pockets. They can help fund important preservation work, and we have absolutely no problem working with them on this stuff. So companies are very warm, and they've partnered with the Nature Conservancy for many years. And yeah, it definitely lends a sheen of credibility to these projects.
Here's 20 new reasons to visit Disney World this year. 1, 2, 3, 4.
If you look at, for instance, Disney, that's a sprawling company with theme parks and cruise lines that burn up diesel fuel. They have office buildings and television studios that consume electricity. So these companies are trying to make major reductions in their carbon footprints, but it's very difficult to change these fundamental ways their businesses operate. So Disney has been a big buyer of carbon offsets that are orchestrated by the Nature Conservancy. One of the projects that they buy from is called Pennsylvania Ridges. And that's a plot of land. Most of the land is actually about a 3-hour drive outside of Philadelphia. Interestingly, this land, 3,000 of these acres, was actually acquired by the Nature Conservancy in the late 1990s. This land was imminently threatened. There was a pending logging contract on this land. So they do what they have done so well for all of these years, which is they go out, they raise money from local philanthropists, and they go buy this land to protect it from developers and loggers. And at the time, according to an archived version of the Nature Conservancy's website, when they were proudly announcing this deal, they said, these threats have been abated because of this acquisition by the Nature Conservancy. So it's really interesting now, fast forward 2 decades to earlier this year when they put forward this carbon project. And if you look through it, this land is a key part of that carbon project. And what they're now saying is this land is now, once again, imminently threatened. 72% of the trees are going to be cut within 5 years. Now, this is just astounding because this land is owned by the Nature Conservancy. They do not clear-cut land that they've bought through philanthropic donations. So this scenario that they've put forward to get carbon revenues is not really plausible. And what that means is when you have Disney coming in and buying these credits, when it eventually lowers its carbon footprint because of these credits, well, that won't be a credible or truthful claim by Disney. So this is an organization that truly understands the threat of the issue of climate change and is wanting to do its part to address this. However, in this situation, it just appears their drive, which they've had for decades, to increase the amount of revenues that it can use for land preservation work. Nature Conservancy and many others see that carbon credits as a pot of money that they can tap into to further their own benevolent aims. But unfortunately, what this has resulted in is claims of climate progress that just aren't really happening. So the Nature Conservancy defends vigorously these deals, and they and others will say, look, our projects are just following the rules that these registries set up. So some would also put some of the blame on the registries themselves because they're setting up the rules which allow these vapid projects to get up and sold. So we've reached out to all of the companies we mentioned in this story, including Disney. They didn't want to be interviewed for this story, but they all told us that, look, we have to rely on the experts out there, and those experts, they say, are these carbon registries that have been set up. Most of these Nature Conservancy deals are set up and sold on this exchange. It's called the American Carbon Registry. Now, it's the oldest of these registries that allow voluntary carbon credits to be sold. They've been around since 1996. What these offset registries do is they set up rules, and any carbon offset project has to follow those rules. But there's this tension that's always there. If the rules are too strict, then it's going to be very hard for carbon offset projects to get up and running. So there's this this balance going on where the registries want rules that attract projects, but they don't want it to be so strict where it will disincentivize projects from getting listed.
One of the challenges with designing carbon offset systems is that there are normally two people at the table. You have buyers and you have sellers. And to some extent, you have policymakers, but the buyers and the sellers are really the ones with the expertise, with the incentive to really participate hard, make a lot of things happen. And the challenge there is that both of them sort of want the same thing, or they're both happy with the same thing. They're happy with low cost offsets and a lot of them because that works for their business model. You end up, though, with nobody really representing the atmosphere, so to speak. Nobody's really representing the climate in those discussions. And so the policies end up biasing the whole system. And you end up in sort of a race to the bottom. And that's what we've seen happen. When it comes specifically to the topic of carbon offsets, I am a fan of carbon offsets in the sense that they can help mitigate climate change. They absolutely can. But if we're not going to do it correctly in a way that actually does help mitigate climate change, then it's nothing but a distraction. And after 30 years, you have to start wondering, is it really just a distraction? And that's really unfortunate, but that's where we are. Ultimately, what needs to happen is systemic change. We're sort of nibbling around the edges with some of these different things. We need to change how we produce energy. We need to change how we transport ourselves. We need to change what and how we eat. We need systemic change associated with transitioning to a low carbon economy. A lot of what we're doing today is not promoting systemic change. It's sort of trying to stick your thumb in the dike to preserve the current system. And at the end of the day, that can't really work.